Imagine a professional, right? Just a guy operating completely in the shadows for 30 years.
Yeah.
He goes to work, he comes home, he, eats dinner with his totally normal middle-class family.
Pays his taxes.
Exactly, pays his taxes, he has neighbors who wave to him in the morning, and over those 3 decades, he methodically murders over 100 people.
It's wild to even think about.
Right. He leaves no clues. He leaves zero behavioral signatures. The police never even suspect he exists until he makes, like, a single calculated mistake involving his own associates.
Yeah, he's entirely invisible.
Entirely invisible. So how does a human being do that? I mean, how does a mind compartmentalize that level of violence while simultaneously functioning as a completely ordinary member of society?
Well, it really shatters every preconceived notion we have about criminal profiling, honestly.
Oh, for sure.
Because we are conditioned by movies and television to look for the obsessive, the erratic guy.
The monster hiding in the dark.
Right, the monster. We just aren't trained to look for the accountant of death.
The accountant of death. Wow. Well, that terrifying contradiction is exactly where we are heading today. Welcome to today's deep dive.
We are thrilled to have you with us.
We really are. Today, we're taking a comprehensive, unblinking look at the most prolific serial killers in modern history.
That's a heavy topic.
It is. And before we get into the mechanics of, how these individuals operated, I want to set the table for you regarding our sources.
Because we are synthesizing a massive stack of materials today.
A mountain of it. We've pulled data from international Wikipedia databases that catalog verified proven victim counts.
Yeah, the verified numbers are key here.
Right. We also have peer-reviewed criminological and forensic analyses, including deep dives into specific psychological studies on offender typologies.
Specifically, we'll be looking closely at the Beauregard and Schlesinger studies.
Yes, those are crucial. And finally, we have a primary source documentary that features a face-to-face interview with the world's most prolific convicted serial killer.
It is an incredibly dense and, frankly, heavy collection of data to synthesize.
It really is, which is why I want to establish our mission and our tone right out of the gate.
Yeah, that's important.
Our goal today is to look past the sensationalized Hollywood myths. If you are looking for a slasher movie, this just isn't it.
No, not at all.
We are deliberately avoiding graphic details just for the sake of shock value. We want to understand the hard, often profoundly uncomfortable truths about the behavioral science here.
Right, the how and the why.
Exactly. How did these offenders operate? Who did they target? And critically, why did law enforcement and society struggle so mightily to stop them?
Because we are treating this as a serious forensic and sociological exploration.
Yeah. I mean, that is really the only responsible way to handle this material.
I agree completely. When you look at the sheer scale of the numbers involved, sensationalizing it does a profound disservice to the victims.
Yeah.
And to their families. Right, and to the actual science of criminology. We need to dissect the pathology, not gawk at it.
Well said. So let's start with those numbers, because the data, it completely upended my understanding of this topic.
Oh, it changes everything.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because if you ask the average person on the street to name a prolific serial killer, they usually jump to the famous ones, heavily covered by the American media.
Sure, they say Ted Bundy.
Or they say Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah, the individuals who have essentially been turned into dark pop culture icons.
Right. Their faces are on magazine covers.
Yeah.
And obviously, their crimes were undeniably horrific. But when I actually opened the international databases and looked at the data...
The actual statistics.
Yeah, killers like Bundy or Dahmer, who had proven victim counts in the 20s or 30s, they represent a tiny fraction of the victim counts of the world's true statistical outliers.
It's staggering.
We're talking about offenders with proven victim counts in the hundreds.
Hundreds, yeah.
So my first question, before we even get into the psychology, is simply definitional. Like, what exactly are we looking at?
But we had to define terms.
Exactly. When the criminological consensus uses the term serial killer today, what are the hard parameters?
Well, it's a vital distinction to make because the media often conflates serial killers with mass murderers or, spree killers.
Which are totally different things.
Entirely different. The psychology behind those are night and day. According to the criminological literature we're pulling from, a serial killer is defined as an individual who murders 3 or more people.
Okay, 3 or more.
Right, in 2 or more separate events over a period of time. And that period of time is usually defined as more than 30 days.
Let's pause on that 30-day rule, because that stuck out to me.
It's crucial.
Why is that specific time frame so critical to the definition? What is like happening in the offender's mind during those 30 days?
So that time represents the cooling off period. And it's basically the defining psychological characteristic of this specific pathology.
A cooling off period,
Yeah. See, a mass murderer kills a large number of people in a single event.
like an explosion.
Exactly. The psychological pressure explodes all at once.
Hmm.
A spree killer operates over a few days or a week in a continuous state of heightened agitation.
Like they're just running on adrenaline.
Right. But a serial killer is different. They commit a murder, and the psychological tension, that compulsion that drove them to act, is temporarily relieved.
Oh, so it's a release for them.
Neurologically speaking, yes. They experience a dopamine release, a sense of deep gratification or control. Then they cool off.
And they just go back to normal.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They might go back to their normal life, their job, their family.
Mm.
But over time, maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe even years, that internal tension begins to build again.
That creeps back in.
Exactly. They begin to re-fantasize about the act until the compulsion becomes overwhelming, and then they seek out another victim.
So the violence is cyclical. It's like a repetitive behavioral loop.
That's exactly it. And the primary motivation driving that loop is almost always psychological gratification, often sexual or sadistic in nature.
Rather than like financial gain or personal vengeance.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so knowing that this is a cyclical, psychologically driven loop, let's look at the actual data from the international databases.
Because the numbers at the top of this list really do defy belief.
They are statistical outliers operating at an industrial scale. I mean, look at Javed Iqbal from Pakistan.
Yes, that case.
He confessed to killing 100 boys.
100.
And the logistics of this are just staggering. He didn't just kill them, he dissolved their bodies in vats of acid in his home in Lahore to cover his tracks.
I mean, the sheer physical labor and calculated organization required to dispose of 100 human bodies in acid.
Without anyone noticing.
Right, without the neighborhood or the authorities noticing the chemicals of the smell, it is almost incomprehensible.
It really is.
It points to a highly organized, deeply methodical offender.
And yet, after achieving that level of total evasion, the way he was caught is completely bizarre.
Yeah, he wasn't tracked down by some brilliant detective.
No, he turned himself in. He literally mailed a detailed letter and a diary containing the names of his victims to a local newspaper.
Which, honestly, perfectly illustrates the intense narcissism that so frequently accompanies this specific pathology.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, for offenders like Iqbal, the murders aren't just about the act itself. They're about power. It's about ultimate control.
Oh, I see.
Eventually, the need to be recognized as a mastermind, the need for the whole world to know the magnitude of his power, outweighed his desire to remain free.
The ego demands an audience.
Exactly. The ego takes over.
Wow. And then we have Pedro Lopez operating across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru in the late 1970s.
The media called him the monster of the Andes.
Yeah. He has 110 proven victims, but investigators suspect the real number is over 300.
300? It's just wow.
Or look at Mikhail Popkov in Russia, known as the werewolf, with 83 confessed and proven victims.
Now, Popkov is particularly chilling.
He really is, because he was an ex-policeman. He used his uniform and his police cruiser to gain the trust of his victims, offering them rides late at night.
He weaponized the very symbol of safety to facilitate his crimes.
He did. And in the United States, you have Samuel Little, with 60 proven and 93 claimed victims, operating across multiple decades.
Right.
Now, looking at this spread, Pakistan, Colombia, Russia, the U.S., I have to push back on a major cultural assumption here.
Oh, about it being an American thing?
Yes. If you watch true crime documentaries, there is this pervasive narrative that serial homicide is a uniquely American phenomenon, or that it's this modern epidemic born out of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's a very common myth.
But this data completely shatters that.
You're absolutely right to challenge that narrative. And the empirical research supports your skepticism.
It does.
Yeah. We looked very closely at a study by Dr. Louis Schlesinger, a prominent forensic psychologist. He explicitly addresses this.
What does he say?
He points out that if you strip away the media hype and closely examine the available long-term crime data, there is actually very little scientific support for the widely held belief that traditional, psychologically motivated serial homicide is rapidly increasing.
Wow. So if it isn't skyrocketing the way the cultural zeitgeist suggests, what is the data actually telling us? Like, where is the blind spot?
Oh, the blind spot is immense. Schlesinger points out that we are seeing dramatic changes in homicide clearance rates.
Meaning, the number of murders that law enforcement actually solve.
Right, those clearance rates have dropped significantly in recent decades.
Okay.
And simultaneously, there is a high incidence of murders with completely unknown motives. No apparent robbery, no domestic dispute, no gang affiliation.
Just a body.
Exactly. Schlesinger argues that this data points to a likely increase in a completely different type of serial homicide.
Contract murder.
Contract murder, yes,
This takes us right back to the scenario I posed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
precisely. Schlesinger details a fascinating, deeply unsettling case study in his research. He examines an independent professional contract murderer who killed over 100 people over a 30-year span.
Yeah, I was reading that section of his research, and I swear I had to read it twice.
It's hard to process.
100 people. 3 decades. And law enforcement was completely oblivious. How does the behavioral science explain that level of invisibility?
It goes back to our definition of what law enforcement expects a serial killer to be.
Right, they're looking for the crazy guy.
Exactly. This hitman did not fit the cyclical, psychologically driven loop we just discussed. He lived a completely normal middle-class life.
The accountant of death.
Right. He kept his family and his social life utterly partitioned from his criminal career. He had adept social judgment, meaning he knew how to blend in, how to be charming, how to be forgettable.
But he also had something else, right?
Yes. His most vital asset, psychologically speaking, was an exceptional ability to encapsulate his emotions.
Encapsulate his emotions, let's break that down. How does a clinical term like that translate to the reality of taking 100 lives?
Okay, so for the psychologically motivated killer, the murder is an emotional release. It is deeply personal, often tied to a dark fantasy.
Right.
But for the contract killer, the murder is entirely transactional.
Yeah.
It is plumbing. It is accounting.
Just a job.
Just a job. By viewing the victim not as a human being, but as a task to be completed for financial compensation, the hitman's brain does not experience the extreme emotional highs or the subsequent psychological cooling-off periods that characterize a traditional serial killer.
So because his motivations were financial, he wasn't leaving behavioral signatures at crime scenes.
Exactly. He wasn't posing bodies. He wasn't taking trophies. He was just doing a job and going home.
So because he wasn't acting out a dark compulsion, he generated 0 red flags for the profilers.
None. The algorithms and the behavioral science units were looking for a completely different animal.
He was invisible because we were looking through the wrong lens.
That's it entirely. It wasn't until he violated his own strict protocols by killing several of his own associates, people he feared might implicate him in peripheral crimes, that the police noticed him.
He got sloppy.
He killed people directly linked to his own social circle, which is the fastest way to get caught.
Makes sense.
Schlesinger uses this case to argue that professional contract killing is having a massive, unquantified impact on society.
Wow.
Yet there's an almost complete absence of forensic psychiatric study on these individuals because our culture and our criminology is so utterly fixated on the psychologically motivated killers.
That is a staggering realization, but it brings us to a crucial pivot in our analysis today.
Okay?
If we want to understand how the psychologically motivated killers, the ones driven by those deep cyclical compulsions, manage to rack up numbers in the high double or even triple digits, we actually have to stop looking at the pathology of the killers for a moment.
Right, we have to shift gears.
We need to shift our focus entirely to the people they target.
This is the transition from understanding the predator to understanding the prey. In criminological terms, this is the study of victimology.
Victimology. And to understand this victimology, the sources introduce a foundational concept called the routine activity theory.
Yes, the routine activity approach.
Now, I've heard this theory applied to burglaries and car thefts, but the synthesis by Chan and Hyde applies it directly to sexual homicide and abduction. How does that translation work?
Well, the routine activity approach proposes a very elegant, almost mathematical equation for a crime to occur.
An equation?
Yeah. It strips away the complex psychology and looks purely at opportunity. For a crime to happen, 3 elements must converge in time and space.
Okay, what are they?
First, a motivated offender. Second, a suitable target. And third, the absence of a capable guardian.
Let's test that equation against the data from the international database.
Okay, let's do it.
A motivated offender, we clearly know they exist. The compulsion is there.
Unfortunately, yeah.
But a suitable target and the absence of a capable guardian, this is where the data reveals a profoundly dark mirror regarding how our society functions.
It really is an indictment of society.
It is. When you look at the patterns across all these different nations, these killers almost never target the powerful, the wealthy, or the highly visible.
No, they don't snatch CEOs or politicians off the street.
Right. They prey entirely on the marginalized.
It is the single most consistent thread running through the history of prolific serial homicide. The offenders are constantly hunting for the path of least resistance.
The path of least
Yeah.
resistance.
You look at Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer in the United States. His victimology was entirely focused on sex workers and teenage runaways in the Seattle-Tacoma area.
Right.
Samuel Little targeted marginalized women, many of whom were struggling with severe addiction, living transient lifestyles on the absolute fringes of society.
And Javed Iqbal, as we discussed, targeted runaway street children who were already disconnected from their families.
They're specifically identifying people who, tragically, society's already deemed invisible.
They know that if they take someone who is transient, someone who is estranged from their family, their absence isn't going to trigger an immediate, massive, front-page police response.
Which perfectly satisfies the third condition of the theory, the absence of a capable guardian.
Let's talk about that term. We often think of a capable guardian as like a police officer on patrol or a security camera.
Right, but in victimology, a capable guardian is much broader than that.
How so?
It means a family member who expects you home for dinner at 6 o'clock. It means a coworker who will call your emergency contact if you don't show up for your shift.
It means a community safety net.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These offenders specifically map out the societal cracks where those safety nets do not exist, and that is where they hunt.
I understand that entirely. It makes grim, logical sense. But there is another category from the database that completely subverts this idea, and I found it deeply unsettling to read about.
I think I know what you're referring to.
The database highlights a specific subcategory of prolific killers: medical professionals.
Yes, the medical professional anomaly. It is one of the most disturbing subsets in criminology.
Because it represents the ultimate terrifying breach of that routine activity equation. In these cases, the capable guardian is the predator.
It is a total inversion of the social contract. The capable guardian is the very person society has formally entrusted with the victim's life.
We saw a stark example of this with Miriam Silikiotis in Greece.
Yes, she was active between 1939 and 1951.
She was an abbess, right? An authoritative religious figure known as Mother Rasputin.
She was. She was convicted of 177 murders, though historical consensus suspects she is responsible for over 500.
500. Now, unlike the killers targeting the marginalized, she targeted wealthy women.
Which breaks the usual pattern.
Right. So how does an abbess murder hundreds of wealthy women without raising alarms?
By weaponizing faith and medical authority. She convinced these women, many of whom were genuinely ill, to come to her high-altitude convent.
Why did they go?
Well, she was doing it under the guise of offering free, spiritually pure tuberculosis treatment.
But the treatment was a complete fabrication.
Total fraud. Once they were isolated in the convent, completely cut off from their families and the outside world, she coerced them into signing over their fortunes and estates to the abbey. And once the paperwork was signed, she murdered them through systematic starvation and extreme medical negligence.
That is horrific.
She had absolute, unquestioned control over their environment. She was their spiritual leader, their physical caregiver, and their executioner, all at once.
And the capable guardians, the families on the outside, believed their loved ones were in the safest possible hands.
Exactly. It's the perfect camouflage.
And we see a modern clinical version of this with Niels Hogel in Germany.
Yes, who will?
The database lists him as a nurse operating between 1999 and 2005. He is convicted of 85 murders, but prosecutors and toxicologists believe the number is at least 106, and he is suspected of up to 300.
Right.
Now, his motivation wasn't financial like Silikiotis. What was driving him to murder patients in an intensive care unit?
Hogel's pathology was driven by a perverse hero complex, which was fueled by intense narcissism.
A hero complex. By killing them.
Well, he wasn't killing them because he enjoyed watching them die. He was intentionally injecting them with lethal doses of cardiovascular medication to induce sudden cardiac arrest.
Why would he do that?
Because he wanted to be the one to rush into the room, sound the alarm, and attempt to resuscitate them.
Oh my God.
He wanted the thrill of the emergency, and he wanted his colleagues to view him as a brilliant, decisive lifesaver.
So the murder was just a byproduct of his need for adulation.
Exactly.
But again, how does he reach a victim count of potentially 300 in a modern hospital setting?
Right.
Where were the capable guardians?
Well, the capable guardians were the other doctors, the hospital administrators, the charting system,
So why didn't they stop him?
because patients in an intensive care unit are naturally expected to sometimes go into cardiac arrest or pass away. The environment itself camouflaged the crime.
The baseline mortality rate hid his actions.
Exactly. It took years and an astronomically high statistical spike in mortality rates during his shifts before the systemic denial broke and the hospital administrators realized the pattern.
Wow. So, synthesizing all of this, the targeting of the marginalized, the weaponization of authority by medical professionals, the analogy that keeps solidifying in my mind is water.
Water. How so?
Well, we have this pervasive Hollywood image of the serial killer as a dark, brooding mastermind playing a complex, three-dimensional game of chess with the FBI.
Right.
But looking at the mechanics of this data, they aren't masterminds. They are opportunistic predators. Like water, they simply flow toward the path of least resistance.
That's a really good way to put it.
They find the cracks in the foundation of society where people are isolated, vulnerable, and least likely to be missed immediately, and they pool there.
I think that is a highly accurate assessment. The extreme victim counts we are discussing are rarely a testament to criminal genius.
No, not at all.
They are almost universally a reflection of systemic vulnerability, institutional blind spots, and societal neglect.
Which brings us to the absolute core of our deep dive today.
Yes, the main event, so to speak.
Having established the theories of victimology, opportunity, and the routine activity equation, we have to apply them to a specific case study.
And the sources point us to the ultimate statistical outlier.
Right. We are going to look at the most prolific, convicted serial killer in modern recorded history.
Luis Alfredo Garavito.
Luis Alfredo Garavito. He operated primarily in Colombia from roughly 1992 to 1999.
A span of just 7 years?
7 years. And he has been forensically confirmed to have murdered at least 193 boys, though he is widely suspected of over 300.
It's hard to even fathom that number.
It is. When he was finally apprehended, tried, and convicted across multiple jurisdictions, his cumulative sentence was 1,853 years in prison.
Let's meticulously unpack his modus operandi, his MO, because it is a textbook, terrifyingly efficient application of the routine activity theory we just discussed.
Okay, let's get into it. Garavito, who was dubbed La Bestia, the Beast, by the Colombian media.
Yes, La Bestia. He was remarkably, horrifyingly consistent in his victimology.
Also.
He targeted boys exclusively, usually between the ages of 6 and 16, but he didn't target just any boys from any neighborhood.
Right, he was specific.
Very specific. He specifically sought out street children, runaways, orphans, or kids from deeply impoverished families.
In the transcript of the documentary we reviewed, there's a local journalist who noted a very specific phrase Garavito used in his internal logic.
Yeah, that phrase was chilling.
He looked for niños bien que estuvieran trabajando en la calle, good kids who were working on the streets.
Right. Let's contextualize that for a moment.
Please do.
In 1990s Colombia, a country grappling with immense economic disparity and internal conflict, these were young boys who were trying to earn a few meager coins, selling trinkets, shining shoes, or washing windshields at intersections.
So they were out in public, but completely unprotected.
Exactly. They were uniquely vulnerable and entirely unsupervised. They were already outside the protective perimeter of a capable guardian, simply by virtue of their socioeconomic necessity.
But Garavito didn't just grab them forcefully off the street, did he?
No, not at all. He understood that a struggle draws attention. He utilized sophisticated manipulation and disguises to voluntarily separate them from whatever fragile safety network they possessed.
How did he build that initial trust with a streetwise child? Like, these kids had to be tough, right?
They were, but he presented himself as harmless or helpful. Sometimes he would pose as a fellow street vendor, offering sweets or a small amount of money for a menial task.
Gaining their trust through shared experience.
Exactly. Other times, he would feign vulnerability, pretending to be a disabled person or an elderly man needing help carrying a heavy bag.
Oh, explicitly exploiting their natural empathy.
Right, exploiting the helpfulness that exists within a child.
But the most elaborate and frankly most chilling disguise was his use of a completely fabricated charity.
Yes. He created a fake foundation that he called Ramando Vida, which translates to paddling life.
Paddling life.
He would dress sharply, present himself as a teacher, a monk, or a social worker, and approach these impoverished boys offering them a profound lifeline.
What was he offering?
A chance to work, study, or live at a specialized care center. He was offering them exactly what they lacked, security and a future.
It's just a psychological precision. It's evil.
It is. Once he gained their trust, he would convince them to walk with him to the supposed location of this charity.
Right, intentionally luring them away from the crowded city centers to isolated areas.
Ravines, dense wooded areas, or abandoned lots on the outskirts of town.
And once they were completely isolated, the trap snapped shut.
The forensic realities of what occurred in those isolated locations are incredibly grim.
Let's discuss it generally, maintaining our respectful tone.
Of course. Once the victim was secured, Garavito would bind them using a very specific type of nylon knot. He would subject them to prolonged torture, severe assault, and ultimately murder them.
And a critical forensic element of his MO, which is vital when we examine his psychological state, is his state of mind during the crimes.
Yes, he was almost always heavily intoxicated.
Specifically consuming large amounts of local brandy.
Exactly, during the commission of the murders.
Which transitions us perfectly into examining the psychology of this predator. Because when you hear a recitation of those forensic details, the human mind instinctively conjures up a foaming, raving monster.
We want the outside to match the horror of the inside.
Exactly. But we reviewed the transcript of a documentary that features a primary source, face-to-face interview with Garavito in his prison cell.
And the reality of the man sitting in that chair is so much more disturbing than a cinematic monster.
It really is the absolute embodiment of the banality of evil.
It is.
The journalist conducting the interview notes her own visceral reaction. She describes Garavito as an intelligent, incredibly banal, ordinary-looking, bespectacled man.
He just looked like a guy.
Right. She notes a physical detail that stuck with her. His hands were thick, cold, and damp.
Yeah.
But what truly unsettled her was his demeanor. He looked the interviewer dead in the eye. He didn't flinch. He didn't exhibit erratic behavior.
He was completely calm.
Completely. And at one point during this conversation about his horrific crimes, he paused and quoted the poetry of Jorge Luis Borges.
Specifically, he quoted a poem dealing with the erasure of memory and the nature of death.
The intellectual juxtaposition is just staggering.
It really is.
So I have to ask the behavioral science question, how does the psychological profiling explain this duality?
Well, according to the forensic psychiatric analyses we reviewed, Garavito was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, severe antisocial personality disorder, and scored extremely high for psychopathic traits.
But how do those clinical diagnoses actually manifest and interact within his mind to allow him to function? I mean, how does he sleep at night?
The key psychological mechanism operating within Garavito is a concept known as moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement.
Yes. If a human being is going to commit horrific acts of sadism and violence, they have to construct a psychological framework that allows them to live with themselves.
Because the brain can't accept being the bad guy.
Right. The human brain struggles to accept the identity of monster. So, to maintain his narcissistic self-perception, Garavito had to forcefully externalize the blame.
He had to convince himself that it wasn't really him doing it.
Constantly. Throughout his interrogations, confessions, and the documentary interview, he relentlessly blamed his crimes on external forces.
Like what?
He blamed his chronic alcoholism, claiming the brandy fundamentally altered his consciousness. He claimed he was influenced by a strange power radiating from the moonlight.
The moonlight.
Yes, and he frequently claimed that the devil literally possessed him and commanded him to kill.
So by attributing his actions to a substance or a supernatural entity, he effectively compartmentalized his actions.
Precisely.
He built a firewall in his brain. He separated the Garavito who tortures children from the Garavito who sits calmly in a cell reading Borges.
Exactly. And that compartmentalization was so absolute, so impenetrable, that he genuinely considered himself a repentant Christian.
He really believed that.
Yes. He told the interviewer, with apparent sincerity, that he spends his days reading the Psalms to seek spiritual peace.
That is just wild.
We even see this cognitive dissonance at his crime scenes. He would sometimes bury the bodies with flowers or branches, and he claimed to investigators that he would pray over the graves of his victims.
He even managed to manipulate a local priest into validating his externalization of guilt while he was incarcerated, right?
Yeah. Receiving absolution because he framed the crimes as the work of the devil, not his own free will.
Okay, here is the specific moment in the documentary that I struggled with the most.
The cat.
Yes, the cat. It's the paradox that completely broke my brain while reading these
It's
sources.
a very difficult moment to parse.
The interviewer asks Garavito about his daily life in maximum security prison, and Garavito suddenly breaks down. He weeps. He cries genuine, bitter tears.
But he isn't crying for the 193 children he murdered.
No. He is crying because his pet cat, which he kept in his cell block, fell from a height and was lost for 8 days.
Right.
And then he looks at the interviewer and says, "If I cry for this little animal, imagine how the parents of my victims feel." How does the psychological science explain that? How does a mind reconcile weeping over a lost pet cat with the brutal, methodical slaughter of nearly 200 human beings?
I understand why that feels like an impossible contradiction, but in the realm of forensic psychology, it perfectly encapsulates the profound emptiness of the psychopathic mind.
Emptiness.
Yes, it is a demonstration of what we call shallow affect and psychopathic mimicry.
Explain that. Like, what is he actually feeling in that moment when he cries?
He is feeling self-pity. Psychopaths are entirely capable of feeling a shallow, sentimental attachment to an animal or an object because an animal provides comfort, demands nothing, and most importantly, it does not challenge their narcissism.
So it's all about him.
Exactly. The cat belongs to him. Therefore, the loss of the cat is an injury to him. His tears are genuine, but they are entirely about his own inconvenience and his own loss.
And his victims, they don't register?
To Garavito, those children were not human beings with inherent value, hopes, or families. They were objects. They were vessels to be used and discarded for his own sexual and sadistic gratification.
So when he attempts to relate his sadness over the cat to the unimaginable grief of the parents whose children he mutilated,
It is a grotesque, intellectualized mimicry of empathy. He knows what empathy is supposed to look like, so he performs it, but he cannot actually feel it.
it's an imitation of humanity, a pantomime.
That's a great way to describe it.
But this psychological deep dive brings us to a massive, glaring structural question.
Okay, what is it?
If Garavito is operating at such an incredibly high volume, we are talking about an average of nearly 3 murders a month every single month for 7 straight years.
A terrifying pace.
Right.
Yeah.
Why wasn't he caught sooner? How does a single individual leave a trail of nearly 200 bodies without law enforcement putting the puzzle pieces together?
This is where we must transition away from the pathology of the killer and critically examine the investigative challenges and the massive systemic blind spots of that specific era.
Okay.
And the primary theoretical concept we have to discuss here is known as linkage blindness.
Linkage blindness, what does that actually look like in practice, on the ground?
Well, the best way to visualize linkage blindness is to imagine a team of doctors trying to diagnose a patient with a severe systemic autoimmune disease.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But each doctor is only allowed to examine one single finger, and they aren't allowed to talk to each other.
Oh, wow.
One doctor sees a rash on the index finger, another sees swelling on the thumb. None of them can see the whole body, so none of them can diagnose the systemic failure.
And Garavito exploited that lack of communication.
Masterfully. He utilized constant nomadic mobility to his immense advantage.
He kept moving.
He didn't establish a permanent hunting ground in one city. He traveled relentlessly across the country's bus networks.
So he was never in one place long enough to draw heat.
Right. The geographical data shows he operated across 11 of Colombia's 32 departments, and he frequently crossed international borders into Ecuador.
Just constantly crossing borders.
He would hunt in Pereira, then immediately move to Jammundi, then travel to Bogota, then to Villavicencio.
And we have to remember the historical context. This is Colombia in the 1990s.
Crucial context. The country was engulfed in severe internal conflicts involving guerrilla warfare, paramilitaries, and powerful drug cartels.
The police had a lot on their plate.
The local police departments were massively overwhelmed by structural violence, they were underfunded, and most importantly for our topic, they did not share centralized, digitized databases.
Ah, so there was no central system.
Exactly. If a child went missing in the department of Quindío, the police in the neighboring department of Risaralda had absolutely no idea.
So no single jurisdiction could see the massive nationwide pattern because they were isolated within their own localized data.
They were blind to the links.
So the lack of technological infrastructure provided him with a massive unintended shield.
Yes, it did.
But there was also a fascinating and deeply tragic forensic failure mentioned in the sources that actively misdirected the police.
The satanic cult theory.
Yes. This is a classic example of how human bias interferes with forensic analysis.
Definitely. When investigators finally discovered a mass grave containing 36 bodies in the city of Pereira, the sheer brutality of the crime scene completely overwhelmed their analytical framework.
36 bodies in one place.
Right. Because law enforcement at the local level simply could not fathom that a single, solitary individual could be responsible for such a high volume of extreme violence. They assumed it had to be the work of a highly organized group.
It's almost a psychological defense mechanism for the society.
Yeah, housed
It's
up.
easier to believe a cabal of monsters did this rather than one guy who sells trinkets on the corner.
Exactly. So the media and the authorities immediately ran with the theory that a local satanic cult was kidnapping and sacrificing children.
But how does adopting that theory actively delay catching him? If they are looking for killers, shouldn't they eventually find him?
Because if your entire investigative paradigm is built on finding a cult, you are looking for specific indicators.
Like what?
You are looking for a group of people, you are investigating secret meeting places, you are analyzing group dynamics,
Right.
you are looking for occult paraphernalia or financial networks funding the group. You are explicitly not looking for a single, transient street vendor who travels alone by public bus.
Wow. So the cult theory fundamentally misdirected the investigative resources for
For
years.
years.
So what finally broke the paradigm? How did they realize the cult was a myth and they were hunting one man?
Well, it wasn't until a few seasoned, specialized investigators stepped back, ignored the media panic, and started focusing intensely on the specific behavioral signatures left at the disparate crime scenes.
Let's define that term. What is the difference between an MO and a signature?
A modus operandi, an MO, is simply what the killer does to successfully commit the crime. For Garavito, his MO was luring boys with the fake charity, isolating them and binding them. An MO can change over time as the killer learns.
Right, they get better at the crime. But what about a signature?
A signature, however, is an action taken by the killer that is absolutely not necessary to commit the murder, but serves their deep psychological or emotional needs. Signatures rarely change.
So what were Garavito's signatures?
Investigators noticed that across these widely dispersed mass graves, there were identical, highly specific elements.
Like what?
The killer consistently left a very specific brand of local brandy bottles near the bodies.
Oh, the brandy we mentioned earlier.
Yes. They found the exact same complex type of nylon knot used to bind the victims in different cities. And the post-mortem trauma to the neck was identical across dozens of bodies.
So once forensic specialists connected those specific signatures, they realized the impossible truth.
Right. The satanic cult was actually just one highly mobile man. That realization finally forced the jurisdictions to communicate and led to the formation of a centralized nationwide task force.
But even when we account for linkage blindness and forensic misdirection, there's another, much heavier, deeply uncomfortable systemic issue we have to confront.
Yes, the systemic apathy.
Exactly, the systemic apathy toward the victims. There is a powerful defining quote from the journalist in the documentary. She says, and I'm paraphrasing the translation here, "When the victim belongs to a low-income family, the attention of the authorities is simply not the same as when it's a child from a wealthy, prominent family."
It is the brutal, unspoken truth at the very heart of the routine activity theory.
Yeah.
The absence of a capable guardian isn't just a failure of the parents, it is a failure of the state.
If a broader society does not value the victims, if they view them as disposable street kids, the urgency, the funding, and the thoroughness of the investigation will inherently reflect that lack of value.
Sadly, yes. The documentary illustrates the systemic failure with a truly heartbreaking interview.
Oh, the brother.
Yes, they speak with the brother of one of Garavito's victims, a young boy named Giovanni, who disappeared in 1992.
The brother describes how the family frantically searched the streets, how they plastered flyers, how they waited by the door.
And how the police offered little to no actionable help.
They waited 20 years. 2 decades of agonizing not knowing.
It wasn't until Garavito was caught, confessed, and physically walked the police out into a field to point out the remains that the family finally found out the truth.
And even with that closure, the psychological toll on the family is completely devastating.
It is.
The brother, even standing there 20 years later with the forensic report in his hand, says he refuses to believe the DNA evidence.
Right. He looks at the camera and says, "I don't believe that, Malanga, that story."
He actively prefers to hold on to the desperate, agonizing hope that his brother is still alive somewhere, perhaps living in another city, rather than accept what Garavito did to him.
It just shows that the trauma inflicted by these outliers doesn't end when the victim dies.
No, it ripples out, creating a blast radius that destroys entire families for generations.
It highlights the profound collateral damage of what we call ambiguous loss.
Ambiguous loss.
Yes. When the justice system fails to protect the vulnerable and fails to investigate their disappearance, it leaves families trapped in a state of suspended animation. They cannot grieve and they cannot heal.
That's incredibly powerful. We've spent a lot of time analyzing the dark depths of the Garavito case. I want to pivot our focus now back to the broader academic sources.
Okay, let's zoom out.
We need to compare this specific pathology against other types of serial offenders to understand the underlying behavioral science.
Because despite what Hollywood suggests, not all serial killers are cut from the same psychological cloth.
Exactly. And criminologists have spent decades developing typologies to categorize them because understanding the specific drive behind the violence is the only way to predict and catch them.
Right. One of the most insightful studies we reviewed was conducted by Dr. Eric Beauregard.
Yes, I found the study fascinating. What does it focus on?
His research specifically looks at the empirical behavioral differences between sexual murderers who target children versus those who target adult women.
Historically, a lot of the famous FBI profiling models were built around killers who targeted adults, right? Like Bundy or Kemper.
Yes, they were the baseline.
So what did Beauregard's data reveal about offenders who specifically target children?
Beauregard's team wanted to see if the victimology changed the behavioral footprint of the crime, and they found significant empirical differences.
Such as?
First, regarding the offender's background, sexual murderers of children are statistically much more likely to have been victims of severe sexual abuse themselves during their own childhoods.
It's the horrific realization of the cycle of violence.
Yes, a tragic repeating cycle,
Ah.
which it should be noted we clearly see in Garavito's own background. He suffered extreme physical and sexual abuse as a child.
Wow. What else did the study find?
Second, the study found that child murderers present much more deviant, highly structured sexual fantasies.
Okay.
And they consume pornography at a significantly higher rate prior to committing a crime compared to those who murder adult women.
So they are incubating and fueling the fantasy in their minds long before they ever act on it in the real world.
Exactly. It's a buildup. And operationally, the way they commit the crimes is different.
How so?
Their crimes show much higher rates of deliberate premeditation. They don't just snap. They are more likely to use specific methods like strangulation, and critically, they go to much greater lengths to hide, bury, or dismember the body to evade detection.
So they're meticulous.
The data shows it is a highly organized, deeply obsessive pathology, which directly contradicts the old assumption that crimes against children are purely impulsive crimes of opportunity.
And this structural understanding brings us back to Dr. Schlesinger's research because he introduces two clinical concepts that I found incredibly helpful for understanding the actual drive, the engine behind the violence.
Yes, the motivational tracks.
He separates these murders into two categories: catathymic versus compulsive. Let's break those down, starting with catathymic. What does that term mean?
So, Schlesinger posits that you can divide these extreme acts of violence into two primary motivational tracks. The first is catathymic murder.
Catathymic.
This type of violence stems from an unresolved, ambivalent emotional conflict within the offender. Often, it's tied to a specific, highly charged interpersonal relationship,
Okay.
or a severe disruption in their own internal emotional balance, what clinicians call their intrapsychic homeostasis.
Intrapsychic homeostasis. So if homeostasis is the body trying to maintain a steady temperature, intrapsychic homeostasis is the mind trying to maintain emotional equilibrium.
Precisely. In a catathymic offender,
Yeah.
that equilibrium is shattered. The emotional tension builds and builds, often invisibly, over a period of months or years until it suddenly bursts out in a singular, devastatingly violent event.
Okay, my analogy for catathymic violence would be a pressure cooker sitting on a stove.
I like that.
The heat source, which is that specific, localized emotional conflict, is turned up high. The pressure builds internally. You can't see the pressure, but it's compounding. Finally, the structural integrity of the valve fails, and the lid just blows off in a violent explosion.
That is a perfect, highly accurate analogy. And the clinically interesting thing about catathymic offenders is that because the violence was an explosive release of a very specific localized tension, their prognosis for rehabilitation is actually much better.
Really?
Yeah.
Because the pressure is gone.
Yes. Once that specific conflict is resolved, or the underlying tension is addressed through therapy or removal from the environment, They are statistically much less likely to reoffend. The pressure cooker has vented.
But then we look at the second typology in his research, compulsive murders.
Right, compulsive murders, which is the exact category Garavito and the other high-volume statistical outliers fall into, are entirely different beasts.
How are they different?
They are repetitive by nature. They're driven by deep-seated sadism, necrophilia, or highly structured deviant sexual fantasies.
Hmm.
For the compulsive offender, the act of killing isn't an explosion to release circumstantial tension. The killing itself is an addictive, necessary ritual. They are chasing a neurological and psychological high.
So if catathymic violence is a pressure cooker blowing its lid, compulsive violence is like a combustion engine.
Yes.
It requires a constant dark fuel to keep running. The engine doesn't want to stop. It is designed to run, and it just needs more and more fuel to maintain its baseline.
That is the terror of the compulsive offender. The compulsion is an intrinsic, hardwired part of their psychological architecture.
It can't stop.
They don't want to stop. And they generally cannot stop without external intervention, which historically means either being physically apprehended by law enforcement or dying.
Which naturally brings us to the evolution of the hunt.
Right.
After exploring the devastating effects of these predators and the massive systemic failures of the 1990s that allowed them to operate with impunity, we have to ask, how has law enforcement adapted?
What are we doing differently today?
Exactly. What are we doing differently today to ensure a Garavito cannot operate undetected for 7 years?
Well, the field of investigative psychology, forensic science, and data management has advanced exponentially, specifically in response to the failures exposed by these types of high-volume outliers.
The sources we reviewed highlight two major intertwined evolutions, right?
Yes. Behavioral profiling and technological data analysis.
Let's start with profiling because I think the public perception is heavily skewed here.
Oh, massively skewed.
TV shows make it look like a magical superpower. A guy in a suit walks into a bloody room, looks at a photograph, and immediately says, "Our killer is a 35-year-old left-handed man who drives a red Volvo and has an unresolved conflict with his overbearing mother."
Right. The Hollywood version is basically psychic deduction. The reality is much more grounded in rigid data, statistics, and clinical research.
We looked at Dr. Anthony Panizzo's extensive research on psychological and behavioral profiling, didn't we?
We did. And he makes it explicitly clear that profiling is not a magical solution that hands you a suspect's name. It is a statistical tool.
So how does the tool actually work in an investigation?
It involves a meticulous examination of the crime scene to extrapolate the likely psychological traits of the unknown offender.
Give me an example.
For example, if a crime scene shows evidence of prolonged sadistic torture, post-mortem mutilation, or very specific, time-consuming rituals, a profiler can use decades of behavioral science data to narrow down the type of person who commits those specific acts.
It helps focus an investigation.
Exactly. If you have a suspect pool of 2,000 people, a good profile can help you prioritize the 50 people who match the psychological matrix of the crime.
Alongside behavioral profiling, the sources highlight geographic profiling, which was pioneered by Dr. Kim Rossmo. How does looking at a map help catch a killer?
Geographic profiling is fascinating because it largely ignores why the offender is killing and focuses entirely on the mathematical geometry of where.
So it's just map.
Yeah, it analyzes the spatial patterns of the crimes, the exact coordinates of where victims are approached, where they are attacked, and where the bodies are dumped.
Okay.
Rossmo's algorithms calculate these points to mathematically determine the most probable area where the offender lives or works.
I was reading about the logic behind those algorithms, specifically the concepts of the buffer zone and distance decay. It's incredibly logical once you see it.
Yes, the math is based on the premise that serial offenders, despite their extreme pathology, are still human beings who follow routine travel patterns.
What does a buffer zone mean?
The buffer zone theory suggests that an offender will not hunt too close to their own home to avoid drawing police attention to their neighborhood.
Right, you don't mess in your own backyard.
Exactly. However, the distance decay theory suggests they won't travel hundreds of miles for every crime because of the time, energy, and financial costs involved.
So if you map it out, you don't get a bullseye right on their house. You get this donut shape.
A donut shape, yes.
A ring of probability where the crimes occur, and the hole in the middle of the donut is likely where they live.
Exactly. It's a mathematical probability matrix that directs police resources to canvass specific neighborhoods.
But the most critical lesson learned from the Garavito case and the Pedro Lopez case isn't just about applying better behavioral or geographic science, is it?
No. It's about data management.
Fixing the linkage blindness, Curing the autoimmune disease we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. The absolute non-negotiable necessity of centralized criminal databases. The only way to cure linkage blindness is to force disparate police departments to share their data in real time.
Do we have that now?
Today, systems like VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program in the U.S., and similar global databases use sophisticated algorithms to constantly cross-reference crime scene signatures, MOs, and victimology across thousands of jurisdictions.
So if a killer leaves a specific brand of brandy model in Florida, and 6 months later it leaves the same brand in Washington state, the algorithm flags the connection automatically.
Yes, without a human detective needing to make the mental leap.
That's incredible.
It connects the dots and establishes the pattern before the body count can ever reach the hundreds. The technological infrastructure we have today has drastically, perhaps permanently, reduced the potential lifespan of a traditional, highly mobile serial killer's career.
That is the structural defense. But what about the psychological defense? Is there a way to stop them before they even start? Can we predict who will become a compulsive serial killer?
This is considered the holy grail of forensic psychology, and it is notoriously incredibly difficult.
Why is it so hard?
Dr. Schlesinger touches heavily on this in his research regarding risk assessment. Predicting extreme violent behavior in a potential sex murderer is complex because, as we saw with Garavito and the hitman, they do not present the way society expects crazy people to act.
Right. They don't look like monsters.
They frequently lack overt psychosis. They don't hear auditory hallucinations telling them to kill in public ways. They don't make overt threats.
So there are no warning signs.
Well, they may have absolutely no history of interpersonal violence, domestic abuse, or assault before they commit their first murder. They know how to wear the mask of sanity.
But Schlesinger does point out that if you look closely at their developmental history, the mask slips.
Yes, Schlesinger identifies a specific combination of ominous signs, developmental red flags that appear early in childhood or adolescence.
These aren't guarantees, but they are heavy correlations.
Right. They include a history of severe, unaddressed childhood abuse. They include an intense, obsessive preoccupation with deviant sexual themes that isolate them from peers.
What else?
They present a profound inability to form genuine empathetic connections. But perhaps the most overt behavioral warning sign is early, documented cruelty to animals.
Why animals? Why is that specific act such a massive red flag for future homicide?
Because animal cruelty is often a low-stakes rehearsal for murder.
A rehearsal, wow.
It allows the developing psychopathic mind to test out feelings of absolute dominance, power, and the infliction of pain on a living creature that cannot fight back or report the abuse to the authorities.
Recognizing this specific constellation of signs early in development is absolutely crucial.
Yes, it is. It allows mental health professionals, educators, and the juvenile justice system to intervene therapeutically before the compulsion calcifies and turns lethal.
Okay, let's take a breath, unpack everything we've synthesized, and bring this all home.
We have covered a tremendous heavy amount of ground today on this deep dive.
We really have. We started by looking at the staggering, almost incomprehensible numbers of the world's most prolific serial killers. The statistical outliers operating in the shadows who make the famous Hollywood killers look like amateurs.
We stared directly into the dark data.
We explored the vulnerability equation, the routine activity theory, and saw how these opportunistic predators specifically target the marginalized, the invisible, the people our society has structurally neglected.
And we took a hard, clinical look at the chilling psychology of killers like Luis Garavito.
Yes, the intense cognitive dissonance of his moral disengagement and the bizarre psychopathic paradox of a man who weeps for a lost cat while systematically destroying hundreds of families.
And crucially, we examined the systemic blind spots.
Right, the linkage blindness, the forensic misdirection, and the bureaucratic apathy that allowed them to operate for so long.
It is a dark journey, but it is an absolutely necessary one if we want to understand the reality of violent crime rather than the myth.
And this connects directly back to you, the listener, because understanding the mechanics of these extreme outliers isn't just about morbid curiosity.
No, it's not about memorizing gruesome facts for a trivia night.
It's fundamentally about recognizing the societal flaws that leave our fellow human beings vulnerable.
When we finally understand how predators use the routine activity theory to exploit the unseen cracks in our world, we realize that the ultimate solution isn't just training better detectives to catch them after the fact.
Exactly. The proactive solution is becoming better capable guardians ourselves.
It's advocating for stronger social safety nets.
Right. demanding better jurisdictional communication from our institutions, and most importantly, demanding more fierce protection for the most vulnerable among us.
The runaway youths, the transient populations.
The people who are so often treated as disposable. Because the true moral strength of any society is measured precisely by how we protect those who have fallen into the cracks.
Prevention requires visibility. We have to choose to see them.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to ponder on your own.
A provocative thought.
We discussed how modern technology, DNA profiling, algorithmic geographic analysis, cell phone tracking, ubiquitous surveillance cameras, and global centralized databases make it increasingly impossible for a traditional, highly mobile, high-volume serial killer to operate undetected for years.
But we have to remember something crucial about human nature. Human pathology doesn't just evaporate.
Exactly. The environment changes, but the pathology adapts.
The psychological drive, that dark, compulsive combustion engine of sadism and control we talked about, doesn't vanish just because there are high-definition cameras on every street corner.
So if the era of the classic high body count serial killer wandering the highways is slowly closing, where is that dark, compulsive psychological drive redirecting itself in today's hyper-connected digital world?
That is the real question.
The diagnostic X-ray machine of modern law enforcement has gotten incredibly good at spotting the physical fractures, but the disease itself is still out there looking for a new place to hide.
Thank you for joining us on this intense, necessary deep dive.
Stay curious, look out for each other, and keep questioning the world around you. We'll see you next time.